San Francisco's U.S. Post Office and courthouse building buzzes with holiday cheer. Deputy U.S. Marshal Wayne Ritchie and his colleagues gather for their office party. Drinks poured, laughter shared. But as the night unfolds, Ritchie feels a strange unease creeping in. A former Marine, he knows his limits. The drinks shouldn't have hit him this hard. Yet the room spins, the Christmas lights blur, and his heart pounds like a war drum. Paranoia sets in. His thoughts turn dark. Do his colleagues resent him? Are they watching him? Driven by an irrational urge, Ritchie storms to his desk, grabs 2 revolvers, and vanishes into the San Francisco night. Stumbling into a bar called Shady Grove, he orders a bourbon and soda. Then he draws his weapon and demands the bartender's cash. Chaos erupts. Another patron intervenes, striking Ritchie and stopping the madness. It would take over 20 years for Ritchie to understand what happened that night. He wasn't himself. He couldn't explain the erratic behavior until he discovered a disturbing truth. He may have been drugged with LSD. The perpetrator? His own government. Welcome to Vail, where we uncover the secrets and conspiracies that shape history. Today, we delve into one of the CIA's most controversial Cold War experiments, Operation Midnight Climax. During the 1950s and 60s, the CIA sought to weaponize LSD as a tool for mind control. Secret safe houses in New York and San Francisco became the epicenters of illicit tests, with unknowing civilians as the guinea pigs. But to understand how this superdrug became the centerpiece of espionage, we must go back to its origins, a quiet Swiss lab in 1943. Inside Sandow's laboratories in Basel, chemist Albert Hofmann worked with a peculiar fungus called ergot, aiming to unlock its medicinal potential. Combining lysergic acid from ergot with diethyl, Hofmann created a new compound. Initial animal tests showed strange results, but Hofmann decided to experience it firsthand. 40 minutes after taking the drug, he felt dizzy, paralyzed, and overwhelmed with vivid visual distortions. By the time he arrived home on a harrowing bike ride, he was convinced he was dying. Yet his vital signs were normal. The next day, Hofmann awoke euphoric, energized, and awestruck by what he'd discovered. He named it LSD. It took another 6 years for Hofmann's discovery to reach the United States. But when it did, it arrived at a time of immense tension. The smoke of World War II had barely cleared, and now the United States and the Soviet Union were locked in a new kind of battle, the Cold War. Agencies across the US government were gripped by fear that the Soviets would outpace them in the arms race and technological advancements. But within the CIA, one particular weapon was becoming an obsession: mind control. The CIA was on the hunt for a tool, a truth serum, capable of breaking the will of enemy agents, forcing confessions from spies, and bending anyone to their will. The search wasn't just for a drug, it was for the ultimate leverage in global espionage. To fuel their mission, CIA scientists scoured medical conferences for the perfect substance. They needed a compound that could induce psychosis, something that could tear down a person's mental defenses and make them vulnerable to interrogation. What better drug than LSD? In 1953, the CIA officially launched MKUltra, a covert program dedicated to exploring the effects of mind-altering substances. They allocated a staggering $300,000 in initial funding, with the freedom to use it however they saw fit. The secrecy surrounding MKUltra was so deep that many CIA employees had no idea it even existed. But one man did, Sidney Gottlieb. Gottlieb was appointed to lead MKUltra. On the surface, he seemed an unlikely candidate, an idealist in some ways, living a pastoral life on a farm with goats and chickens. He studied Buddhism, meditated, and was known for being a devoted husband and father. But beneath the gentle exterior, Gottlieb was a hard-edged operative, a man who'd overseen other dark CIA projects, including Project Artichoke, which tested techniques like electroshock, sensory deprivation, and experimental drugs on overseas prisoners. For Gottlieb, the ethics of the experiments were secondary to their strategic importance. As CIA Director Alan Dulles famously said, Gottlieb had a license to kill, and he wielded it with chilling precision. Dulles trusted Gottlieb implicitly, allowing him to run MK Ultra with minimal oversight. One of Gottlieb's first moves was to secure all the LSD in the world. With $240,000, he bought up the entire global supply of the drug from Hoffman's laboratory, which, at the time, was still legal. The CIA struck a deal with the lab. Anytime another buyer requested LSD, the lab was required to report it. With this monopoly in hand, Gottlieb and the CIA could finally begin their mind control experiments in earnest. But the volunteers within the agency weren't enough. Gottlieb needed to understand how the drug would affect people who had no idea they were being dosed. In November 1953, just months after MK Ultra's launch, Gottlieb invited a group of scientists from the Army Corps Special Operations Division to a remote retreat in Western Maryland, a secluded cabin called Deep Creek Lodge. After dinner one evening, one of Gottlieb's colleagues surreptitiously added 70 micrograms of LSD to each scientist's cocktail. As the drug took hold, the atmosphere in the cabin shifted dramatically. Casual conversation turned into chaotic laughter and philosophical ramblings. Eventually, Gottlieb revealed the nature of the experiment. Most of the men laughed it off, accepting it as part of their job. But Frank Olson, a 43-year-old Army scientist, didn't respond so easily. Olson spent the following days battling crippling anxiety, paranoia, and agitation. When he returned home to New York, his wife noticed a profound change in him. He seemed distant, unnervingly off. He confessed to her that his colleagues had mocked him and that he'd done something terrible. His mental state continued to deteriorate, and just 10 days after the retreat, Olson agreed to receive psychiatric treatment at a CIA-approved facility in Maryland. His colleague, Robert Lashbrook, was assigned to escort him there. But when they couldn't find a flight, they decided to stay overnight at the Statler Hotel in New York City. Hours later, the unthinkable happened. Frank Olson fell through the window of his 10th floor room. The official narrative was that Olson had taken his own life, but for many, the suspicion lingered that he had been pushed, a casualty of the CIA's covert experiments in mind control. Olson's death was a tragic moment of reckoning, and the government temporarily halted LSD testing to investigate. But when the dust settled, the CIA's mission remained unchanged. Sidney Gottlieb, the architect of the MK Ultra program, was once again handed the reins. However, this time, a new rule was imposed. Gottlieb had to work with subjects who could be easily erased from the agency's records. Gottlieb was never one to shy away from challenges, and this time, he was already several steps ahead. About a year and a half before Olson's tragic death, in June 1952, Gottlieb had learned about George Hunter White, a Federal Bureau of Narcotics officer who had been dosing unsuspecting Manhattan Project engineers with concentrated cannabis. White's experience made him the perfect candidate for Gottlieb's covert program. So, Gottlieb arranged a meeting, and soon after, White became a CIA consultant on a highly classified operation. White's background proved invaluable, but it wasn't just his experience that made him an asset. It was his connections. As an officer with the Narcotics Bureau, White had access to a network of sex workers, drug dealers, and criminals. People Gottlieb knew would be less likely to report the CIA for slipping drugs into their drinks. These were individuals who, in the eyes of the agency, could be used as disposable test subjects. Getting White approval to join the project took nearly a year, but when it came through, Gottlieb wasted no time. He drove straight to New York, bearing a $3,400 check, which White cashed and used to rent 2 apartments in New York's Greenwich Village under the alias Morgan Hall. These apartments would serve as the backdrop for what would become one of the most notorious experiments in the CIA's dark history, Operation Midnight Climax. By the fall of 1953, White was ready. He'd set up shop on Bedford Street. One apartment was furnished to appear like an ordinary home, where unsuspecting civilians could be lured. The other was a high-tech surveillance hub, outfitted with one-way mirrors and microphones, so CIA agents could observe the subjects without being seen. White spent his evenings frequenting bars in the area, weaving elaborate tales about himself. Whether posing as a bohemian artist or a fisherman, he was always on the lookout for potential victims. After a few drinks, he'd invite them back to the apartments, where they were offered food, cocktails, or cigarettes, laced with LSD. While most of his victims were younger women or sex workers, White occasionally lured his friends into the experiments too. One of them, a magazine editor from the Vixen Press, became one of his subjects. But LSD wasn't the only drug in White's arsenal. There were other, even darker experiments happening behind the scenes. One of these involved a woman who wandered into Lenox Hill Hospital, convinced she'd been dosed. After being examined, the doctors dismissed her, claiming she must be mistaken. In a chilling revelation, it was later suggested that the CIA had an understanding with both the New York City Police Department and local hospitals, urging them to keep the project under wraps, citing national security. And so, for the next 2 years, White continued his grim work, slipping LSD to dozens, if not hundreds, of unsuspecting civilians. But in 1955, a new challenge arose. White received a call from the Federal Bureau of Narcotics in San Francisco, asking him to fill the role of district supervisor. With White on the move, Gottlieb decided it was time to formalize the project. He took sub-project number 42 and rebranded it Operation Midnight Climax. Now based in San Francisco, White needed a trusted partner. Enter Ira Ike Feldman, a former military intelligence officer. Feldman had been undercover in San Francisco before, posing as a mobster seeking heroin. When White approached him with an offer to join the CIA's project, Feldman didn't hesitate. His first assignment was to recruit sex workers to help lure men back to a new safe house at 225 Chestnut Street in Telegraph Hill. These women were tasked with inviting men back to the apartment, offering them drinks, and slipping LSD into their beverages. But this time, the stakes were higher. The combination of LSD and sex was expected to reveal even more. White believed that the intimate setting would break down the men's defenses, making them more likely to divulge sensitive information. Feldman paid the women $50, $100 per client, and sometimes even used heroin as payment. The women were also promised immunity from legal trouble should they need it. Meanwhile, White began setting up the new safe house at 225 Chestnut Street. The apartment was equipped with state-of-the-art surveillance technology, feeding live footage into a nearby apartment that served as the listening post. The space itself was opulent, decorated with provocative art, red curtains, and even a pornographic library. The agents who monitored the activities through the one-way mirror were known to pass around martinis while watching the subjects, often trying LSD themselves. One particularly daring experiment involved luring men who worked on covert aviation projects. The instructions were clear: seduce them, drug them with LSD, and try to extract information about military technology. After intercourse, the agents found men were more willing to talk. It seemed that sex, not LSD, was the ultimate truth serum. But there was a significant issue. Those running the operation were incompetent to evaluate the results clinically. George White, Ira Feldman, and the rest of the operatives lacked any formal training in psychology or medicine. In fact, the only professional input came sporadically from a psychiatrist from Stanford Medical School, who was ill-equipped to provide clinical treatment if someone suffered a serious reaction to the drugs. Yet, the operation pressed on, unchecked and reckless. It wasn't just the original safe houses in San Francisco. 2 more opened in the Bay Area, one at the Plantation Inn on Lombard Street, and another at 261 Green Street in Mill Valley. The scope of the experiments expanded as well. Gottlieb began testing bizarre devices, stink bombs, itching powder, and even drug-laced needles designed to poison wine bottles. One particularly audacious test involved trying to dose an entire room with LSD using an aerosol can. The agents threw a party for the occasion, but a heat wave forced the windows open, rendering the experiment a failure. White's operations soon extended beyond the safe houses, as he began slipping LSD into drinks and food at local beaches, bars, and restaurants. One of his victims was Ruth Kelly, a singer at a San Francisco club called the Black Sheep. After rejecting White's advances, she suddenly found herself under the influence of LSD right before stepping on stage to perform. She was later hospitalized to recover, her mind still reeling from the drug. By 1971, White himself seemed to acknowledge the operation's madness. In a letter to Gottlieb, he wrote, "Of course, I'm a very minor missionary, actually a heretic, but I toyed wholeheartedly in the vineyards because it was fun, fun, fun. Where else could a red-blooded American boy lie, kill and cheat, steal, deceive, rape, and pillage with the sanction and blessing of the All-Highest?" But even as things spiraled, Operation Midnight Climax continued for another decade, carrying on its chaotic mission in the name of national security. However, by 1963, change was imminent. Following the failure of the Bay of Pigs invasion, CIA Director Allen Dulles, one of Gottlieb's key supporters, was forced to resign. His successor, John McCone, was kept in the dark about the program's existence until he dug deeper. With the help of the new Inspector General, John Ehrman, McCone unearthed the full extent of the CIA's experiments. Civilians dosed with LSD under the pretense of national security, many of them falling ill as a result. Ehrman immediately recommended shutting the operation down. Despite McCone's attempts, the safe houses continued to operate unofficially until 1964, when the program was finally suspended. It wasn't until 1966 that the CIA formally shut down both the New York and Bay Area safe houses. Ironically, it was the same year that LSD was made illegal in the US. Gottlieb, always 2 steps ahead, had anticipated this moment. He ensured no records were kept on Midnight Climax, though MKUltra's documentation survived. When the Watergate scandal rocked the nation in 1973, Gottlieb saw the writing on the wall. Fearing incriminating evidence, he drove to the CIA Records Center and personally ordered the destruction of any documents related to the operation. What he didn't know was that 20,000 records survived the purge, containing expense reports, memos, and even Gottlieb's own admission that LSD was inherently ineffective as an intelligence tool. With Richard Helms resigning as CIA director post-Watergate, Gottlieb retired, and the door seemed to close on this dark chapter of history. But his past wouldn't let him go. In 1974, investigative journalist Seymour Hersh broke the MKUltra story in the New York Times, exposing the CIA's cruel experimentation on civilians. The government had no choice but to investigate. By the time the Church Committee was convened, Gottlieb was called back to testify. His condition? Immunity for his actions during the program. The Church Committee, perhaps underestimating the full scope of the MKUltra operations, accepted. Gottlieb was seen primarily as a chemist working within the program, rather than its mastermind. Yet, when the time came, he feigned amnesia. In a private hearing, he claimed to have forgotten nearly everything: his superiors, the department he worked for, and the details of his assignments. He did admit, however, that other agents had experimented with LSD before releasing it to the public. In 1977, author John Marks filed a Freedom of Information Act request, seeking more details about the Covert program. Around the same time, George White's personal diaries were released, revealing disturbing insights into his involvement, as well as his interactions with Gottlieb and other CIA officials. However, none of the conspirators faced anything more than a slap on the wrist. In 1977, the Church Committee established a task force to locate the victims of the program. But with most of the documentation destroyed, finding those affected proved nearly impossible. Thousands may have been impacted, yet only a handful were notified of their involvement. Among them was Deputy U.S. Marshal Wayne Ritchie, whose strange and erratic behavior at a government Christmas party in 1957 had haunted him for years. After learning about the CIA's experiments, Ritchie pieced together the puzzle, realizing that he was likely one of the unwitting victims. Despite filing a lawsuit in the early 2000s, Ritchie's case was dismissed in 2005 due to lack of concrete evidence linking his actions to LSD exposure. So, who did Gottlieb's experiments ultimately serve? The tests were marketed as a safeguard against the growing threat of communism, but in the end, they seemed to ruin the lives of the very citizens they were meant to protect. And as we reflect on these dark chapters of history, one question looms large. How many more covert operations have unfolded or will unfold behind closed doors? What conspiracies have gone unnoticed or dismissed as paranoia that could merit a second look? Thanks for tuning in to Vail. Stay curious and keep questioning what you see.